Have you ever seen a figure standing alone at the edge of a cliff, their back turned to you? I began, leaning forward as the fire crackled between us. The new rangers looked at me with a mix of curiosity and apprehension. If you do, remember Rule 14. Do not call out to them. It was a misty autumn evening, the kind where the forest is shrouded in a thick, enveloping fog that muffles sounds and distorts shapes. I was on a routine patrol, the ground beneath my boots damp with fallen leaves, the air filled with the distant hoot of an owl. The fog was so dense that my flashlight barely cut through it, creating an otherworldly glow. As I navigated the familiar path, I came to a section of the forest that opened up to a sheer cliff. The view from the edge was usually breathtaking, but that night, the fog obscured everything, turning the cliff into a shadowy abyss. As I approached, I saw it. A lone figure standing at the very edge, their back turned to me. At first, I thought it might be a lost hiker or someone contemplating the view despite the fog. My initial reaction was concern. I wanted to call out, to check if they were all right. But as I took a step closer, something about the scene felt off. The figure was perfectly still, too still, almost as if they were frozen in time. I hesitated, the words caught in my throat. The forest seemed to grow quieter, the sounds of nature fading into an oppressive silence. An inexplicable sense of dread began to creep over me. The air grew colder, and I felt a chill run down my spine. I took another step closer, my flashlight illuminating the figure's silhouette. They were dressed in old-fashioned clothing, and their posture was rigid, unnatural. The mist swirled around them, creating an ethereal glow that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. I felt an almost magnetic pull to call out, to break the silence, but something held me back. Then I remembered the warnings from the veteran rangers, the stories they told about the lost souls of whispering pines. These were the spirits of those who had taken their own lives, forever trapped in their final moments of despair. They stood at the edge of the cliff, waiting for someone to call out to them, to acknowledge their presence. And when they did, the lost souls would drag them over the edge, claiming another victim. The realization hit me like a cold wave. This was no ordinary person. This was one of the lost souls. I knew I had to get away, but my feet felt rooted to the ground. The figure remained eerily still, their back turned, but I could feel their presence growing stronger, more oppressive. Fighting the urge to call out, I slowly began to back away. Each step felt like a monumental effort, the air thick with tension. The fog seemed to close in around me, the shadows deepening. I kept my flashlight trained on the figure, watching for any sign of movement, but they remained motionless, a silent sentinel at the edge of the cliff. As I put more distance between us, the oppressive feeling began to lift. The sounds of the forest slowly returned. The rustling of leaves, the distant calls of nocturnal animals. I turned and walked briskly back towards the ranger station, my heart pounding in my chest. I resisted the urge to look back, knowing that the figure would still be there, waiting. That night, sleep did not come easily. My mind was filled with images of the cliff and the silent figure standing at its edge. In my dreams, I saw faces twisted in sorrow and despair, eyes pleading for release. I knew then that Rule 14 was not just a precaution. It was a matter of life and death. Remember Rule 14, I said firmly, meeting each ranger's gaze. If you ever see a figure standing at the edge of a cliff, their back turned to you, do not call out to them. They are the lost souls of those who took their own lives in the forest, and they will drag you over the edge with them. The fire crackled softly, the night growing darker around us. The fire crackled softly, casting eerie shadows that flickered and danced around us. The new rangers sat in tense silence, their faces illuminated by the dim glow of the flames. They needed to hear another tale, one that would reinforce the importance of Rule 14, a tale of a ranger who ignored the warnings and paid the ultimate price. Let me tell you about Daniel, I began, my voice steady but filled with an undertone of sorrow. Daniel was one of our most compassionate rangers. He was always ready to lend a hand, to help those in need, no matter the situation. It was a foggy evening, much like the one I had experienced. The forest was cloaked in a thick, almost tangible mist that dampened sound and made every shadow seem alive. Daniel was on patrol, his heart and mind focused on ensuring the safety of anyone who might have lost their way in the woods. As he navigated the familiar paths, he heard something that stopped him in his tracks, a faint, heart-wrenching sobbing. It was coming from somewhere near the cliffs. Concerned and driven by his compassionate nature, Daniel quickened his pace, the sobs growing louder and more desperate as he approached. He soon saw a figure standing at the edge of the cliff, their back turned to him. The figure's shoulders shook with each sob, the sound echoing through the fog-laden forest. Daniel's first thought was that this person needed help, that they were in terrible distress. Without hesitation, he called out to them, his voice filled with concern. "Hey, are you okay? Do you need help?" he shouted, his footsteps crunching on the damp ground as he moved closer. The figure remained silent, their sobs continuing unabated. Daniel's heart ached for them. He took another step forward, determined to offer assistance. He called out again, his voice gentle but insistent. "Please, let me help you. It's not safe to be so close to the edge." The figure slowly began to turn, and Daniel felt a chill run down his spine. The face that met his gaze was not one of a living person, but of a lost soul. Pale, hollow eyes filled with an eternal sorrow. The figure's mouth opened, but no words came out, only the continued sobbing, now accompanied by a cold, ghostly wind that seemed to swirl around them both. Before Daniel could react, the figure's ghostly hand reached out towards him. He felt an inexplicable pull, a force drawing him closer to the edge. Panic set in as he tried to resist, his feet slipping on the damp ground. The figure's grip tightened, and Daniel realized too late that he had made a grave mistake. He struggled desperately, but the force was too strong. The cliff's edge crumbled beneath his feet as he was pulled closer. The last thing he saw was the sorrowful eyes of the lost soul, their expression filled with a sadness that seemed to reach into his very soul. With a final, heart-wrenching sob, the figure dragged Daniel over the edge, their forms disappearing into the misty abyss below. The search for Daniel began almost immediately. We combed the forest, our hearts heavy with fear and dread. Days turned into weeks, but there was no sign of him. His belongings were found near the edge of the cliff, his flashlight, his radio, and a personal notebook filled with his thoughts and observations. But Daniel himself was gone, his fate sealed by the lost soul he had tried to help. The realization that he had been claimed by the forest's malevolent spirits weighed heavily on all of us. We knew then that Rule 14 was not just a guideline. It was a vital protection against the ancient evil that lurked within Whispering Pines. The fire burned low, casting eerie shadows that flickered and danced around us. The new rangers sat in a tense silence, the stories of Daniel's tragic fate and my own harrowing experience weighing heavily on their minds. It was time to delve deeper into the history behind the lost souls and the importance of Rule 14. After Daniel disappeared, the atmosphere among us rangers changed. I began, my voice steady, but filled with a somber tone. We all felt the loss keenly, and the forest seemed darker, more menacing. It became clear that the warnings were not just superstitions, but essential rules for our survival. We decided to investigate further, to understand the true nature of the lost souls in the cliffs. We delved into the history of Whispering Pines, uncovering old records and legends that hinted at the origins of these spirits. Whispering Pines is an ancient forest, and its secrets run deep. For centuries, people have been drawn to its beauty, but also its mysteries. Many came seeking solace or escape, and some, tragically, came to end their own lives. The cliffs became a place of sorrow, where the souls of the departed lingered, unable to move on. These souls, filled with despair and regret, became trapped in the moments of their death. They stand at the edge of the cliffs, reliving their final moments over and over. They are drawn to the living, especially those who show compassion, hoping to find some form of release. But instead, they ensnare those who call out to them, dragging them into the abyss. We found old journals and records from those who had encountered these spirits before. Their descriptions were eerily similar. A figure standing at the edge of the cliff, back turned, silent but sorrowful. Those who called out to them were never seen again, their souls claimed by the spirits of the cliffs. After Daniel vanished, we all became more vigilant. We knew we had to respect the rules and stay alert. The forest is filled with many dangers, but none as insidious as the lost souls in the cliffs. We documented everything we could find about these spirits. We spread the word, made sure every ranger understood the importance of Rule 14. And we made a promise to ourselves and to those who had vanished, to always heed the warnings and protect one another from the forest's malevolence. As rangers of Whispering Pines, it is our duty to protect the forest and its visitors. But it is also our duty to protect ourselves from the ancient evils that lurk within its depths. We must respect the rules, stay vigilant, and never underestimate the forest's power. Stay safe. And remember, if you ever see a figure standing at the edge of a cliff, their back turned to you, do not call out to them. They are the lost souls of those who took their own lives in the forest, and they will drag you over the edge with them. As the fire burned down to embers, the forest around us seemed to grow darker, the sense of being watched intensifying. The weight of the stories I had shared settled heavily over the group, a stark reminder of the malevolent forces that lurked within Whispering Pines. The night was silent, save for the occasional rustle of leaves and the distant hoot of an owl. The rangers knew now that the forest held secrets best left undisturbed, and that the figures at the cliffs were among its most insidious traps. Somewhere deep within Whispering Pines, the lost souls stood at the edge of the cliffs, waiting for their next victim. The forest watched, silent and still, its dark secrets hidden within the shadows, ready to ensnare those who dared to forget the warnings.